Welcome to Make Me Data Literate, the podcast that makes data intelligible from the Australian Data Science Education Institute. We're on a mission to make the whole world data literate. I'm your host, Dr. Linda McIver, and every week I'll interview someone with a wild and wonderful relationship to data. Let's see what we can find out. Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Me Data Literate. Very excited today to have Polly Hemming from the Australia Institute to join us. We're going to be talking about the carbon credits and all kinds of dodgy deals. So buckle up. Welcome, Polly. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited. So can you tell us who you are and what do you do?
Sure. You've just said my name's Polly Hemming, and I'm a senior researcher at the Australia Institute, which is an independent public policy think tank based in Canberra. So we are independent. We've got no political or private affiliations. We don't take commissions from political parties or industry, and we cover a range of work, including economics, industrial relations, climate and energy, gender, technology, democracy and accountability. And I'm based in that climate and energy program. And as you've said, my work focuses on carbon credits, and increasingly other environmental markets, but not just those things, how they fit more broadly into this sort of concept we describe as climate integrity and greenwash by government and industry, because of course, like all these things are so deeply related. So I look at carbon offsets, whether they're real, how they're being used, and how all that feeds into Australia's climate policy and performance on climate.
I think it's incredibly important to have that independent voice on these things because it feels like everyone's trying to manipulate us in different directions and um presenting things in ways that make them look like they're doing things that they're not. And especially the government and business efforts to look like they're doing something on climate
Mm.
without actually doing something on climate is so dangerous. So I'm um very thrilled to be able to talk to you and have that perspective on, how much of it is real? What's going on here?
Yeah, I know. I think you've just kind of nailed it. It's there's so many vested interests now, and the lines between government and industry are so blurred in Australia, that it's really hard to know, even when government is telling you things, the extent to which that is real and what the real story is, or whether it's spin, and you know what the motives are for whatever they're telling you.
And we forget that it doesn't have to be that way. I think we're so kind of, we've got that boiled frog thing going on where we think this is normal and it's the way it is and this is the way, there's no alternatives. But, there are different ways of doing things and countries that are doing things differently. I've been looking at the GDPR legislation in the EU and the interoperability laws and stuff, so that they are forcing the tech industry to do things in a more consumer friendly and sustainable way. So we could be doing that. It's those sort of, hey, there are alternatives. So it's great to have the voice of the Australia Institute going, doesn't have to be that way. What did you have to learn to do your work, and was there anything missing from your formal education?
So this is a really hard question to answer, because I guess I guess what I had to do, this is not formal, but I had to learn to trust my gut when something intrinsically didn't feel right, and then try and work out why that wasn't the case and what could be done about it. So what we do at the Australia Institute is we research issues and we come up with ideas that genuinely, sorry, can make Australia a better and fairer place. And we conduct research that drives the public debate and secures policy outcomes that really do try to make Australia better for people and for the environment. We're not a university, so we've got some flexibility in the way we do our research and the way we communicate it. We're not limited to certain methodologies, or ways of thinking, and at the same time, we sort of don't have the luxury of doing projects that over several years like you would do if you were, doing academic research. So my work involves constant information gathering, what's in the media, what government's saying, where is government policy likely to be going based on what it's done so far, looking at whether government claims stack up, what's happening internationally, what's happening with businesses. And it also involves communicating information. Our tagline is "We change minds," and you can't do that unless you can clearly explain what's happening to people, and not just explain it in a way that suits your agenda, but in a way that actually empowers them to understand things themselves. That when a lobby group, the idea is that you give people the knowledge and the tools to unpack spin themselves, or go and find the real picture. So I guess what I had to learn was to understand how to gather information from a range of sources, and to critically analyze it, to extrapolate it, sort of synthesize it, and then communicate it. And also to be constantly skeptical, not negatively cynical all the time, but just skeptical. And also, as you've just said, like, think about better or alternative ways of doing things. So not kind of be locked into this idea that, well, here's the box of policy crayons you've been given. You can draw a picture using those only and kind of working within that. But, well, maybe I don't want to use just the crayons. Maybe, you can use paints or textures, or there we can do whatever we want in Australia. And I know you've spoken to my boss, Richard Dennis, and he says that all the time. Like, we can't do everything, but we can do anything. And so
Yeah.
you really need to have imagination and not be locked into just because this is the way others are doing it, or this is what's always been done, that it has to continue. So in terms of what's missing from my formal education, there was really no course or degree that can prepare you to work in a think tank looking at greenwashing. Like, this is probably the best, most impactful, most interesting job, but ultimately the weirdest job I've ever had. And I think a job like this chooses people. You don't actually choose the job.
Yeah.
So I did marketing and teaching and science at university, and I've worked as a teacher and a public servant, an editor, a lab assistant, and a science communication officer, and all that has, funnily enough, like, culminated in the skills to do my job now. I did some statistics at uni, which is kind of where my head goes when I think about data. To me, that still feels completely abstract. Like, I still don't really fully understand that course that I did. I know it was about animal scats, but it's completely removed from what I do now and how I think about um, information. And in all those jobs, I know I was gathering qualitative and quantitative data, whether it was consumer opinions, student samples of work, water quality testing, like how many broods of eggs are water fleas having, how many times someone has accessed a website. And I think that has given me a range of ways to think about information and how it's used, even if it's not kind of officially codified as data or data analysis. So that was quite a long answer.
That's a really rich and varied background, though. I love the way strands of them all come in to help you in this job. There's a couple of things I wanted to zero in on. One was, you said something about not being cynical all the time, but being skeptical, and I think that's a really important distinction. And it's a big part of the work I do, is try to give students projects that mean they have to be skeptical, and they have to challenge their own work, and and the work of others, and go, well, this is the story you're telling me, but what other stories could there be? But without that, it's that difference between rational skepticism and conspiracy theories, that you like, oh, I'm teaching people to be skeptical, and some people are like, is that a good idea right now? So it's finding that balance between the cynicism, which is hard to avoid some days, um,
Oh,
especially
really?
if you read the news, and that sensible, rational skepticism of going, well, hang on a minute, can we just unpack that and make sure that it's actually, that the story is valid. It's a really tricky line to walk sometimes.
Oh, definitely. Especially, it becomes cynicism sort of becomes shorthand, I think, and especially in climate. And this is a trap that I'm sure I have no doubt I fall into it, that I'm guilty of this. But you'll see a headline, and an author or a certain publication, like is it the Daily Telegraph or whatever, um, and instantly write off whatever's being said or happening there. Like, probably it's justified 90% of the time, but just it you've got to, I suppose, make sure that that doesn't become your first response always. It can be an efficient way of, like, cutting out a lot of extraneous crap, and you only trust certain sources. But yeah, actually, a journalist said this to me yesterday when I was talking about the government's sort of gas expansion, and some of our climate agencies. And she did make the point, like, oh, sometimes I think we're really hard on journalists. Like, is it too easy to jump to conclusions that they're doing the wrong thing? And it's a completely valid comment. If I'm hooking in, I really have to have the receipts to back up everything that I'm saying. But at the same time, we should be scrutinizing, especially when it's our politicians.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the same time, you see the media outlets getting rid of more and more stuff, and so you've got one journalist covering an insane number of areas, and the temptation to just publish the press releases
Oh,
must be
exactly. Yeah.
intense, because there just isn't time to do a proper job of it. It's like teaching. There isn't time to be a really good teacher given the load that people have. But that's a rant for another day.
Yeah, I was going to say, but one I can participate in readily. If you want to go there, we could just.
Yes, I'm sure. um, there was something else in. Oh, yeah, you talked about how your job requires gathering information from lots of different sources, and analyzing it with a skeptical eye. It's a little horrifying, really, that that's not something that your formal education readily prepared you for, and mine didn't either. Like, it seems like that is something that should be fundamental to education. It seems like that's an important life skill, not just for your job, but for anybody, to be able to really look into things and figure out the validity of the story.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So, I mean, I should preface that with that, like, I was not a good student. It's
Neither was I.
it's highly possible that someone did try and teach me how to do that. I think we had that course in I don't know how old you are, but, like, all these formal subjects, sometime in the 90s, got dropped, like geography and history,
Yeah.
all got dropped for, like, SOS and
Mm-hmm.
social sciences. And I think the idea was there that you go and did investigative things. And I know that as a teacher, we've done inquiry-based learning. And so I I think it's there. The premise is there, but I don't know if anyone actually articulates and says, this is, you need to use critical thinking. Like, I don't want to say too much either way, just because it's more than possible that I had a teacher that said, this is how you should be thinking about things, this is how you should be looking for information, and I would have just ignored them or not listened, or, like, all my reports said apathetic, talks too much. It's like difficult staying on task. So yeah, I wish someone had taught me, but at the same time, A, they might have, and B, I would have had to learn my own way anyway.
But that's an indictment of the system as well, isn't it?
Mm.
Apathetic is not the word I would have used to describe the work of yours that I have seen.
Oh, you didn't see me in Year
So-
9 French, though, so.
Well, I can relate to that too. But if it's not engaging to someone who clearly has the capacity to be engaged when it's worth it, that's another conversation. But this is Make Me Data Literate, not what's wrong with the education system. So I'm very easily distracted by that. um, so you also said that one of your key roles is to communicate with people and particularly to educate them to be able to do the same kind of work effectively, to be able to think for themselves and spot the greenwashing um, through their own skills. Is there something you feel like one thing, if people knew about data, it would just make that a whole lot easier? Is there one particular thing where you feel like, oh, if only people understood this, it
Mm.
would make everything better?
I think what when I think of data, it's in that very formal sense. Like I do think of that stats course in first year,
Mm,
ecology, and what I wish everyone knew is that data is just information. Like there's so many different types of data, and my grandmother was a mathematician, my uncle was a physicist, another one does like just fills reams of textbooks with equations. And so I come from a family of scientists, and I'm not. Uh, I've always leaned to sort of more towards the artistic side of things. Not that you can't be both or that they're not related, but I always grew up thinking that data is just numbers, and that's
yeah.
something I've never been interested in or good at. So I've always had a really unimaginative way of understanding that word or that idea. But I mean, this podcast sort of prompted me to think about it, but it's something I've come to understand in my job. Because we've got a lot of economists here who do the graphs and the maths and
Mm,
the business and the statistics. But everyone uses data every single day. It's just not
yeah.
codified as data. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think people attribute a very narrow mathematical definition to it, which is very limiting. And you individually and intuitively and unconsciously use data you make in every decision throughout your day. And organizations do that too. They use it formally, like the mathsy bits, or anecdotal or qualitative data to make decisions. Politicians use it to make all their decisions, and it's really just bits of. Stop me if I'm going on too much, but it's bits of just discrete information that you put together in a certain way, like those little single Lego squares. And with those little squares, you build an argument, an idea, and you put them together to show a pattern or build on them and curate a body of knowledge. And you can either put the squares together well, or you can put them together poorly, and you can use it sort of with integrity, or you can use it to mislead. The data itself is not enough. Like there needs to be integrity and consistency and transparency in its use. And you can put those bits of Lego together in a way that does, like, mash them together with super glue in a way that doesn't actually fit, but present it. And it also needs to be brought to life. Like you can have reams and reams of data, whether it's numerical or hundreds of case studies that show a trend, but having it is not enough. Like you can't just show someone that bucket of Lego squares
Yeah.
and say, but I have the data.
Yeah.
Communicating, which is, I think, where I kind of come into it, is equally important. And you often need a team to be able to do that. Like as I said, we work with a lot of economists, and if I have an idea or a hunch, they actually help me find the data. And those methods, those formal methods, they help me to usefully tell the story, or back up what we're saying. So
I
yeah,
think
that's what I wish I knew, people knew.
that's hugely important. That idea that data isn't just numbers; it's not just things in a spreadsheet. I'm building a data science course at the moment with Grok Academy, and we're talking about how, actually the Indigenous oral history that tells you about the state of the climate and the state of the things that particular plants and animals do at particular times. That is data. And the information contained in cave paintings is data. And um, it's not a way we tend to think of data. And it increasingly at the moment, I feel like we tend to think data science as way out of our reach, because it's got to be machine learning and artificial intelligence, and we can't do it, and we certainly can't understand it. And that's a trap, I think.
Yeah, I think I really agree, and I think it's probably a trap, um, that trap's not the right word when I'm for what I'm about to say, but that deters a lot of people from getting either into your area or mine, especially if you're a woman. Like,
Hmm.
I always grew up thinking, I was really bad at maths and women are bad at maths, and so data maths, that's all the same thing. And you go through life with that understanding, like, this is something I'm just bad at, and I think it probably goes back to what you were saying. Like, it probably just wasn't taught very well,
Hmm.
or taught in the right way. And there's no one. I'm not blaming anyone for that, but then you carry that with you through life, and it prevents you, I think, from scrutinizing things, or even if something doesn't feel right, if someone else presents you with a whole lot of numbers, then you go, well, that must be right.
Yeah.
There's a percentage sign after that. So,
Yeah.
so
Absolutely.
yeah, realizing that if you don't understand something, it's not it's not on you. It's that the data's not been presented in an accessible way, or communicated i-
Yeah.
in a way that actually helps you. If anything, it's probably being used to confuse you deliberately.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're right that that is it it prevents people from engaging with it in a appropriately skeptical way, but also that can be used and to kind of bamboozle people. And
Mm.
you couldn't possibly understand this, but those of us who understand data can see that lie, 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 lie.
Oh, well,
um,
yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. Come on.
Oh, I was just going to say economics is used the same way, and you hear Richard Dennis rant about that
Mm.
endlessly,
Mm.
because it's oh, you couldn't possibly understand this, therefore just let us let superior beings like us make those decisions, and don't worry your pretty little head about
Oh yeah,
it.
it's incredibly powerful. It's so arrogant. I was just going to give you an example of like some of the work that I do, which is about sort of exposing dodgy carbon credits in Australia, and we have this regulator, this nominal regulator of carbon credits in Australia, and that's what I mean. They've done an appalling job regulating our carbon credits, and they're sort of as deeply involved in this system as any business is. But every time you hear them in Senate estimates or on the radio, if someone is refuting one of their methodologies, or exposing the fact that, 75%, but this many carbon credits are not real, they get on the radio and they say, well, we have better access to data, and they were using old information, and they were using out of date modeling. And that's all they say, is that they say, oh, that no, they have a fundamental misunderstanding of the method. And like, it's not completely related to what you're saying, but that's what they do. They try and undermine the critics and the people asking the questions by saying, oh no, but they
Yeah,
used the
that's
wrong
exactly
data.
it. It's like, just don't worry about it. We know better. Let's just move on.
Mm,
It's quite deliberate, that kind of technique, and it bothers me, and it's one of the reasons I do what I do, is trying to build everyone up with enough data science understanding that they can go, hang on a minute, that
mm.
lack of transparency and just kind of trying to sweep dissent under the rug and pretend it's not real is distressing. So the next question is about mistakes, and there is one coming about misuse. So I like to differentiate between just getting it wrong and actively trying to mislead people, but sometimes it's difficult to split the two. Sometimes you can't tell whether uh, we think we understand the intent behind people's actions, but we don't necessarily know what was in their head at the time. So what are some of the worst data mistakes that you've seen?
Um, this is a hard one to answer, because I can't think of sort of a specific example. I guess, kind of going back to that cynicism, I think falling into the trap of cherry picking data to suit your narrative, or presenting it out of context by mistake or deliberately is a really common mistake, and it's probably one we all make. I know certainly, like, I really have to catch myself and say, well, is this what I want to find, or is this what this is saying? And even everyday life, we have this tendency in arguments to say to your kids or your partner, or you always do this, or you never do that, and that's. I mean, it's not in my case. I'm right all the time, but
Obviously.
that can be that can be a case of
Yeah.
cherry picking data, or or if you go, I suppose, back to the start, like running some sort of test or looking for something like whether it's a search term or that kind of injects any type of bias in what you're looking for, that could mean that the sample you collect in the first place, like whether it's an experiment or literally a Google search or paper titles that you're looking for, that inadvertently fit the narrative
Yep.
that you want. We do a lot of polling at the Australia Institute, and we've got sort of a team that works on it to make sure that we don't inadvertently ask questions that lead people, and that you sort of have questions that are fair and that are going to like produce a accurate representation of what people think or know or understand about something. Because I mean, we could write all sorts of leading questions and probably get the answers that we want, but it would undermine trust in our organisation, and in what we do. And as you just made me think of something before when you were talking about sort of that Indigenous knowledge. As a teacher working in remote Indigenous communities, like our kids had to do NAPLAN testing, and this is in Ramingining in Arnhem Land, and these are kids who speak, sure, 4 or 5 other languages, but not necessarily English. And it shows levels of literacy or numeracy according to a very limited definition, and there's a reason that data is collected that way. But if you are really testing for literacy or numeracy in a broad sense of among Yolngu kids, you'd do it in quite a different way, and even using different materials. So I think that's a mistake, that you kind of set out with an agenda that's potentially, or you don't test in a way that's going to yield accurate results.
I think that's a fundamental point, and it keeps coming up again and again. The idea that even the question you ask Google shapes the result that you get is something that I think we don't often understand enough and take into account. But also the leading survey questions, man, I see that all the time, and it used to drive me crazy when I was watching people trying to evaluate courses, and is how awesome was this course, from fabulously awesome to spectacularly awesome. It's like, maybe we could rephrase that. There's a certain bias in the question. That one's obvious, but it's so easy to write questions that really look for particular answers and that don't leave space for things you haven't thought about, or perspectives that you're not kind of aiming for. And I think that's that may be one of my big things that I wish everyone knew about data. That the way you ask the question shapes the results that you get.
Yeah, and actually that's a good point, that data's not objective. I think we always think of it that way, but it's like anything else. It's really not.
Yeah, 100%. I just did a blog post actually about how the definitions underpinning our data shape everything, and that the person who writes the definitions has a lot of power. And every data collection that we do has definitions underpinning it. So it's a really interesting point, and something that we don't think about often enough, I think. So this is going to be particularly applicable to carbon credits, I suspect. When have you seen data deliberately misused?
I think anything related to climate, unfortunately, or climate reporting or policy is misused. And I think that's because inherently climate is a political issue. And, I don't need to say it shouldn't be, but of course, I think we all know it is. And so data is egregiously misused by industry, but also by government to make it look probably a better example than carbon credits. Like a really good example, I think, that maybe not everyone knows, is that the Australian government often misuses data to make it look like they're doing more about climate change than they really are. And the example I'll use is that the way the Australian government says that Australia's emissions in Australia have decreased, like Minister for Climate and Energy Chris Bowen said the other day in his annual annual climate statement, Australia's decarbonised the economy by 12 million tonnes a year through to 2022, and they will the previous government and the current government will always say, Australia's emissions have reduced 22% since 2005, which kind of implies that we're around halfway to our 43% target. But it's not true. We haven't decarbonised. What's happened is that we deliberately and retrospectively set the baseline year, that 2005 year, that we're measuring against. It was a year that had really high emissions. So we deliberately said we'll measure against this year that had really high emissions. So any reductions since then look far greater than they are. We've also cherry-picked our emissions accounts. Like, we have this thing called the inventory, our national inventory reporting, and it's like every source of emissions in Australia, from industry, transport, waste, agriculture, but also this thing called the land sector, which is trees, basically, trees and plants, and that can be a sink or a source, depending. Trees grow, they suck carbon out when trees get cut down, obviously. And it can include agriculture as well. So we've also cherry-picked in our accounts the fact that it rained quite a lot at some points since 2005, and there was drought at other times since 2005. So that means that trees grew and cows died, and there were less emissions. And so in our accounts, yes, this offsets, or I guess better, this offsets or masks the fact that emissions from fossil fuels and transport and industry are actually growing in Australia. So the accounts make it look like Australia's on a good path. When you account actual emissions, Australia's actually only emitted not 22% less than 2005 levels, but 1.8% less than we did in 2005.
Which was a high emissions
and
year.
the cherry pick goes.
Oh.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And just to, I'll just add one more thing, which is really, it's a bit outrageous. The way we have big bushfires in Australia, right? The bushfires release a lot of carbon. We had one, catastrophic one fairly recently. Australia doesn't count those in its accounts. So it doesn't say a one-off release of carbon. The idea is that it counts them over a long-term average. So you will have a big release of carbon from a bushfire, but trees grow back, and so you sort of average it out over the long term. Wow. I know it's crazy, but even better, we don't know the long-term impacts of a fire as big as that. We don't know whether that carbon will ever be stored again, or we treat fire in the south. I'm ranting a bit, and I will stop. But we treat fire in the fire in the south. when we account for fires in our accounts, it's the southern fires that we kind of put into a long-term average. Fires in the north are accounted for differently.
Why?
It's got something to do with sort of. This does have to do with carbon credits. You can generate carbon credits for running cool burns, or low heat burns throughout the cooler part of the year that theoretically prevent that buildup of biomass to stop those bigger fires that just rip through everything.
Wait, so actually burning things and releasing carbon generates carbon credits?
Yeah, but the idea is that it's an avoided emission And theoretically, like, there's some merit to it, and um, like a lot of Indigenous ranger groups that carry out this burning practice, but also a lot of farmers that carry it out too. But just the idea is that you've avoided the emissions by carrying out a cool burn. Yes, you've released some carbon, but you've potentially avoided releasing a whole lot more. And look, there are problems around that method itself, but just to demonstrate the way the cherry picking to show that is that fire in some ways is reducing emissions, and fire in other ways we're
Yeah,
not
so they're
counting, but
counting the burning of some
we're
trees, but not the
yeah,
burning of others. Like,
yeah,
wow.
yeah, 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 and yeah, taking credit for when trees have grown, but oh, fire, no, that's so it's the idea with our accounts is it's all
Yeah.
anthropogenic stuff that you account for, and they're effectively saying we took no fires, we don't take responsibility for them because they're natural, but trees growing somehow
That's
is
on us. Yeah, yes.
yeah. So that's so to round it off, that is the worst example of data being deliberately misused to mislead
Wow.
people, I think, because Australians think that we're doing fine on climate when we're
So it
really
really
not.
makes you want to lay it out, doesn't it? Like in a spreadsheet and go, this is the things we count, the things we don't count, the things we count twice, the things we like. What? None of this makes
Yeah.
any sense.
Yeah, and it hides so much. It hides the fact that fossil fuel emissions are growing, and industry emissions and transport emissions are all growing in Australia.
Oh,
It's just
yeah.
terrible.
So it comes back, again, doesn't it, to definitions of what counts as, a carbon credit, definitions of what counts as releasing carbon, what counts as anthropogenic. Like, I didn't know that people had the power to, actively change the growth of a tree. Like that's like I'm going to take credit for all the trees in my garden.
Mhm.
Oh boy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. See, this the same thing happened
Sorry.
with Richard, where he's like, "Oh, let me tell you about the GDP." Like, what? What? That can't be real. Hmm. Yep. Once again, gonna have to go away and process this a little bit, and then probably throw some things. That's how do you spot it? Like, it must have taken you forever to unpick that. It sounds like a deliberately tangled and obscure mess of definitions and rules and things. How are we supposed to spot that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I can't claim to have gone through Australia's inventory to to find that out myself. This is the work of others in this field who, um, yeah, I guess relying on conversations with trusted people, and reading trusted sources, and this is the how Australia. It's called short. Shorthand is it's LULUCF. This is what we call it: land use, and forestry change. This is what it is in our accounts, and there's people who are experts
Mm.
in this field, and they've written about this extensively. So once you have an understanding, it's then much easier to go back through the accounts. Once someone's walked you through them, and to work out where they're doing this again, and other things that they're gaming. So it certainly wasn't me hooking into the account. So to be clear, I used to be a public servant for the federal government in the climate portfolio under the coalition, and I fully believed everything that we were being told. I believed I thought I was skeptical around, the gas-fired recovery and things like that, but public servants don't really have an understanding of what's
Mm.
going on here either. Like, no one ever looks at the accounts. We see what's written on our website, and we see that that we're meeting and beating our target, and you don't fully believe it, but you don't also realize the full extent to the way people are being misled, and I think that is terrible. And if you go to, oh, here's a good example. Uh, there's an FOI document up at the moment, and I tweeted about this the other day, and it's public servants talking about the way to frame the Scarborough gas project in WA, which is a gas project by Woodside, and it's one of Australia's most polluting projects. Like it is going to be catastrophic. It will billions of tons, like 1.7 billion tons or something of
Oy.
CO2, and you see public servants talking to each other about how to present these numbers. And one public servant says, "Oh, use this figure because it sounds smaller, like it when you put it against this figure." And sorry, it's a rambling way to answer your question, but if this is what public servants who are meant to be giving
Mm.
frank and fearless advice, who are meant to be
Mm.
impartial, are doing with data and information, well, they're relying on someone else just to give them the information and then changing it slightly. They're not. That's a real worry. This is the institutions we should be able to
Yeah,
trust, and we
because
can't.
they're shaping the message that the government wants them to shape rather than
Mm,
telling us the way things really are. That's like I knew it was bad, and obviously, I'm a consider myself something of an environmentalist, and I worry about climate and all the rest of it, and I knew we weren't being given the truth, but the extent and the willful misuse is just horrific when you look
mm.
it in the eye. And I don't know how you don't become intensely cynical all the time when you see things like that.
I think yeah, it's hard not to. I'll give you one more example just to like really top the rage cherry on top of the cake. But the way the government accounts for emissions from fossil fuels. So we're just, you'll hear a lot of talk about renewable energy, and we're decarbonising the economy, and that might be true for our kind of domestic
Mm,
electricity system, but we are still persevering with new gas and coal projects. There's 114 in
yeah.
development, and the way the government justifies them is that, oh well, the emissions won't count in Australia's accounts because it's all for
Oh, this
export.
is the guns don't kill people, people kill people
So
argument.
yeah, yeah. So we are, yes, exactly, or like sort of a
Mm,
drug dealer cleaning up their act, but continuing to push um, drugs on
mm,
school kids. So I mean, it's not true that the gas and coal projects here will result in significant domestic emissions, but that amount is small compared to the billions of tons that are released overseas
mm.
once we export them. So that's what the government says. It, according to international accounting, we don't have to count those emissions, which no, technically they don't, but it's disingenuous to say that it doesn't factor into
Yeah.
our
Well,
emissions at
it's not
all.
our responsibility is never a productive line of argument.
Mm, mm.
Oh boy. Um I just want to pause so we can go off and throw things for a minute and come back. It's so infuriating. It's hard to look past it. Um, what do you, when you see graphs in the media? What are the questions that you ask to try to figure out, to try to apply that rational skepticism?
I probably, given my aversion to, I never look at a graph and think, great, I
Mm.
can't wait to get stuck in. But it's habit, first of all, just to read the story around it, like not the literal words, that those as well, but the context, like what's the
Mm,
publication, who's the author, what conclusions they're drawing, because that's kind of
mm,
data around the graph as well. So I suppose I work backwards, and it's not to draw a conclusion before looking at the graph, but it's a way of understanding what you're looking at and being efficient about the way you process it. If it was a graph by Andrew Bolt, I'd probably approach it in a different way than if it was a graph by the
Yeah.
IPCC, and which goes back to the idea of data being used in integrity. Just because there's a graph doesn't mean what's
Yeah.
in it is fact. That the mere presence of a graph could be being used to mislead and present something as scientific
Yeah.
or factual, when it's not. And that's something I try and sort of tell my kids as well, because I mean they're small and they're idiots and they just consume way too
Yeah.
much
Yep.
YouTube, and they just
Yeah.
believe everything
Yeah.
they see on it. And so I'm really trying hard to say, okay, think about, you've just seen a whole lot of ads before this video. That means the person that is presenting to you is making money from
Yep.
what they're telling you, and like what they're telling you is designed to make you feel a certain way, and they're going to try and get you to watch more videos to make more money. And again, I keep
No,
deviating. I'm
this is
sorry,
great.
Linda, but there's like it's the context around the graph to me that is far more interesting than the numbers. And then I sort of begrudgingly get into the, okay, so what are they
Yeah,
actually
that
saying
idea of context, I think,
here?
is so important, and it's interesting to me because when we teach data whether it's in schools or universities, we have a terrible tendency to teach it divorced of context. We go, here is a
Mm,
statistical process, here is a data set, apply the one to the other, bing bang boom, done. Like, but you can't do that without understanding the context, because it might not be the right process to apply, or there might be flaws in the data set that mean that that's not, that there's a problem with your output. And you can't actually figure out how to analyze the data set unless you understand the context. And it's often not something we teach, and that worries me.
yeah, well, that kind of goes back to that stats course I did at uni, first year stats, and it was about kangaroo scats, and I can't remember what we were meant to probably work out what populations or something
Mm.
were in this area. But um, conversely, I did another course later on, just sort of out of interest, which was it was forensic anthropology, I think, and it was by correspondence, and we got sent bones in
Wow.
the post, and like these were not real bones, but you'd had to work out how this person, like who this person was. Were they female? How they died? What like comorbidities did they have? And while it wasn't just it wasn't that pure statistics, sorry, but you had to kind of do analysis of uh, or look at statistics around like bone density, and whether like the predisposition of females to have osteoarthritis in their hips
Mm.
and things like that. And so it was kind of statistics and data by stealth, and a much more effective way of basically comparing different sample size sets and or data sets, sorry.
Yeah, so it's putting it in context and giving it meaning that actually makes it memorable and makes it, learnable, really.
Yeah, yeah.
That's I, I promise I didn't set that up, but that's the summary of my work right there. That's why I do what I do. So I like that. What is it that excites you about data?
Like I was going to say nothing. When I see a spreadsheet, as I said, I just have a complete aversion. I
Stress
hate it.
response.
But I think again because it's out of context. Yeah, it is. No, Ria, you're absolutely right. It really is. I can read a narrative and pick that up quickly, but when there's numbers, it's just a
Mm.
much slower processing, um, I guess, process for me, and I have to read it and reread it, and it comes much less naturally. So I guess impatience with it, like, and you're right, like you just there's a mental
Mm.
block as soon as you look at it. But I don't want to be negative. So well, I think when you've gathered data intuitively, like that data intuitively that I was talking about earlier, and probably subconsciously, and you're starting to see patterns in things or ideas, and when you go back over sources and you see that, yes, like I haven't just magicked up this idea about state-sponsored greenwash or um, kind of industry capture, regulatory capture, something is really happening here, and you can find like the receipts to prove it. It's incredibly validating, and it helps you. It doesn't just help you prove what you're talking about and sort of realize that no, I'm not crazy. There's something here. Like, we're talking about like those
Yeah.
conspiracy theories before. Yeah, you've got the proof, and that's the magic of doing research in a think tank. Like, it's data informing an idea, but then you have that idea and you go and find other data to back that idea, and then you grow it, and you can turn that into something that you can communicate and tell a story to other people. And that genuinely does really excite me when something is nagging at me, and then I realize it's a thing and I communicate that, and it this is not just sort of because it's gratifying, but if people contact me and then go, oh, yes, that, sorry, I was trying to stop myself swearing there. Oh, yes, like, you've just described what I was like, what I've been feeling. And yes, I always knew that there was something not right with this. Thank you for capturing that. And it's not related to ego. It's just, yeah, it's
Yeah.
how fucked is this? It's a thing. And I think that's probably he's my boss. I'm not obliged to say this, but that's why Richard's work
Yeah.
is so powerful, because before I worked at the Australia Institute, I read some of his books, and it's like, oh, you've articulated that, no, I'm
Hmm.
not crazy. What didn't feel right intuitively is there's reasons for why that didn't feel right, and you've provided the evidence and the way of explaining it that um, I now have I feel confident in scrutinizing these things myself.
That's so, like, that brings up an aspect of it that I hadn't really focused on or articulated, the idea that it builds connection, that that you,
Mm,
when you tell these stories and people are like, oh, that, like, now I understand it, now it makes sense of it, that you have this connection and this almost community building around a shared understanding that we didn't have before. That's
mm.
magnificent. I love it.
Oh, good. Yeah, I think it's powerful, especially in climate when you're uh, there's so many hard to unpack
Yeah.
ideas, so much technical stuff or abstract ideas, but people aren't stupid, and they know that something's not right, but if someone else often needs to, or has the luxury,
Mm.
like, I think my job is a luxury. I have the luxury to go and pursue that idea and then explain it and sort of discuss it, and that then helps others understand it. And I suppose this is why people
Mm.
vote certain ways, and you can create movements with things like this.
Absolutely. What a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating and
Ah, that's a
enraging
pleasure.
and all of the things, really. Thank you so much for joining us. That was amazing.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for having me and letting me talk.
Thanks for listening to Make Me Data Literate. You can support the work of the Australian Data Science Education Institute at givenow.com.au/ADSEI. Tune in next time for more conversations with amazing data experts.